Lace by Nyarm. Chapter 3. That wasn't too hard, but now he is. As soon as he got home, he ushered her inside, acting breathless and excited. She said something about the cold, but he didn't pay it any mind as he ushered her into the door. He saw her staring at him after he closed the door, looking almost embarrassed. The threshold seemed to be a great place for reconsidering one's choices, or so Sangwoo had observed in the body language of who knows how many people. It was pretty pathetic in his opinion. People should know better than to follow others home at the first sign of interest, the first cheeky smile. Well, at least she was inside. "Hey, can you get the lights?" he asked, the picture of congeniality.
"Oh, sure,"
she mumbled and dawdled on over to the wall, tracing it to find the switch in the pitch darkness. Luckily he'd propped his bat up against the umbrella stand earlier when he busied himself, making it as inconspicuous as an old worn bat could be. He quietly picked it up and tiptoed up behind her before swinging down hard. A dull thud rang out as she fell to the floor, hopefully not bleeding everywhere. It had been a long time to find the exact force needed to knock out someone without killing them. Apparently one had to make the brain vibrate against the skull. Well, whatever that meant. He hoped it had worked. It was really boring when he killed them right off the bat. It was far better to let them suffer and writhe in his basement, in a constant state of fear, always wondering what had happened next, when he'd finally kill them. It was the best, being able to lord his control over others in the way it had been lorded over him all his life. It was almost cathartic in a way, and he loved it. She hadn't made too much sound, so he wasn't worried about his sweet bum waking up. The man was a fairly deep sleeper, despite the heavy bags under his eyes. Sangwoo wondered if they were from malnutrition, rather than from the lack of sleep. Well, he could worry about that later. He had a woman writhing on his hardwood floors. It was almost rude to Bum, like she was dirtying the ground with her presence. That in mind, he dragged her over to the basement door before shifting her up onto his shoulder so he could take her down. Rather late, he realized it was still dark and he'd forgotten to flick on the light after all. He leaned over the basement stairs to reach for the hanging string that served as the switch for the environmentally unfriendly light bulb. He pulled it and a yellow light flooded the basement, giving it, to him at least, a warm and homey cast. The woman on his back was breathing very faintly, which was good as it meant she was still alive. He would have just shoved her down the stairs, but that probably would have killed her. Or would it have? He wondered as he reached the end of the basement staircase. He'd heard that humans sustained far less damage when unconscious, since they were far more limp and pliable. He could try it out sometime though, but now he had a little work to do. First, he unceremoniously dropped the woman on the floor. It was cement, but she probably wouldn't die from something so small as that. He set about stripping her of her clothing, since those were supposed to be for Bum. Rather late again, he quickly checked her top for blood, but only found a tiny spot on the edge of the sweater's collar, which was good enough for him. He'd have to wash these anyway, or he was sure Bum would bitch at him for one reason or another. Cute as he is, Bum could really be an annoying little germ freak. With her sweater off, he could see that she was in fact wearing a dress, which, while a little plain, was good enough for now. He didn't really like the lace, though. Maybe he should try actually shopping for Bum. He'd do it online, he thought, as he went over to get some rough-hewn rope and duct tape. When he walked back over, he was suddenly hit with a little bit of surprise. By now, he'd normally be pretty hard. The sight of a woman stripped of her underwear, silky black hair with her madding blood, unconscious and vulnerable to his will, usually did it for him like nothing else. Weird. Bum must be turning him into a homo or something. He tried remembering back to when Bum was in this woman's position, all tied up on the floor of his basement, squirming and squealing like a pig for slaughter. Though, that Bum was a little lame. The Bum now, though, the one Sangwoo had carefully crafted and conditioned and moulded into the perfect captive. Well, he'd probably just submit if he told the brunette to let him tie him up again. Ah, there was that familiar heat. He set to work tying the woman up, letting his hands wander and stroke her smooth skin, imagining Bum the whole while. When he was done, he left her there and went upstairs, making sure to turn off the light on his way up. He hustled a bit when the lights were out. The dark is scary when there's nobody around. He hoped it would be scary for her too. Hoped she'd wake up lost and alone and fearing for her life. He was getting too excited, he thought as he made his way back to where Bum lay sleeping. He entered and saw his little bundle curled up and breathing softly, expression soft. Sangwoo crawled into bed next to him and did his best to get just as comfortable as his house guest. He planted a kiss on Bum's forehead, just as his mother used to do for him when he was a child. He hoped his affection reached the brunette while he was sleeping, as his mother's had reached him. Chapter 4. Wakey wakey, eggs and handies. Sangwoo awoke the next morning feeling refreshed, and revelled in the feeling of the warm, softly breathing man sleeping next to him. He screwed up his face in an effort not to yawn as he slowly sat up, stretching out his muscles and popping any joints that needed popping, rolling his neck from side to side. It was still dark, seeing as his room had no windows, but Bum's warmth and the general feel of the early morning kept him from being at all fearful. He was almost tempted to curl back up into the seductive embrace of his warm covers. He had far more self-control than that, however, and so he resigned himself to fully greeting the waking world. He didn't need much sleep, and hadn't ever, seeing as the only detrimental effect of his insomnia was the heavy black bags under his eyes. He stretched out his hand to nudge the still unconscious Bum awake. His captive's shoulder was a little bony. Sangwoo thought he should probably start feeding him a bit more. He thought he had been, but Bum's body seemed intent on keeping his physique similar to that of some sad, abandoned puppy, which was actually a very apt description for the boy's demeanour also. He gently nudged his side a couple times, though it was to no avail. He supposed Bum must have been particularly tired the night before. It would likely be best to let the brunette sleep in a little longer, but Sangwoo found he didn't really care. His dick was a little hard this morning, likely because of last night's activities, and he was considering allowing his little pet to help him with his problem. Bum was a fan of all the sappy, intimate shit girls tended to fall for, so he leant over to suck the soft flesh at the junction of his bedfellow's neck. Bum didn't really taste like anything, something Sangwoo himself had made sure of with near daily showers, but it was always fun to lick along the skin for some reason. It was smooth, delicate, and easily torn. He liked the fragility of it all. He wondered if he could give Bum a hickey before the man even had a chance to wake up. The taller male sucked hard at the stretch of skin encompassed by his lips for a little while. He pulled back and admired the blossoming redness there, before realizing that his dear still wasn't awake and becoming mildly irritated. Perhaps that wasn't erotic enough. He shifted on his knees and drew the covers away from the sleeping man, causing his tiny form to curl up a bit. It was very cute, and Sangwoo couldn't help but grin at the sight. He fished his dick out of his pants unceremoniously, only to find that he wasn't hard anymore. He guessed he could just focus on messing with Bum instead. They would have a lot of fun when Bum was in his new outfit anyways. He pushed Bum's skirt up and around the older man's narrow, bony hips and leered at his legs as more skin was revealed, watching as calves widened into thighs and thighs into ass. Bum hadn't been wearing any underwear since he'd began his life with Sangwoo, which was always a particularly exciting thing to remember at random points during the day, and especially now while his dick was out. He tucked himself back in, to ensure he wouldn't get too excited. It would be good to get Bum some underwear, however, for his modesty. He leaned back into a cross-legged position before staring at the prone man's limp cock. He was almost offended at the slight to his hickey-giving skills. He poked at the soft flesh, realizing he didn't have much experience with another man's junk. The taller male reasoned that he could probably just wing it, though, seeing as Bum treated his every touch as though it was some sort of orgasmic salvation. Their last two sexual encounters were 90% Bum staring up at him with wide, wet black eyes and begging for something or other after all. He was so eager to suck cock too. It was almost admirable. He didn't feel like lowering himself to that level quite yet, so he instead started to lightly jack the other man off, tugging at his skin as it gained form in his hands and reveling at the increased speed in the unconscious man's breathing. The larger male felt another smile creep across his face. Sangwoo pulled back and licked his palm for some lubricant before gently resuming his ministrations. It was only when he thumbed over the slit that he heard a peep from his sleeping beauty. Bum whimpered, face twisting a little. He still wasn't awake? Sangwoo felt a bit of irritation well up in him at the shift of Bum's still resting head shift up on the pillow as his cock twitched in his hands. "Hey, wake up," he said as he pinched the man's cheek hard. Finally his eyes began to flutter open groggily, awakened by the lingering pain in the fat of his cheek. Bum shifted up onto his elbows, eyes widening in surprise after he realized what was happening. The red flush on his face spread wider into a very pretty blush that made Sangwoo want to fluster him even more as his irritation instantly dissipated. So he did. He pumped at the dick in his hands a firmer grip, a method that was clearly effective, as evidenced by the crumpling man's sweetly confused face into a pleased one. Sangwoo, Bum stuttered out, looking a bit overwhelmed. Whoa. Sangwoo cut him off by leaning forward and pressing their lips together, something that drew a needy, almost rapturous moan out of his partner. He really was far too responsive. So responsive, in fact, that Sangwoo was sure it would seem fake coming from any other person. But Bum was special. He hummed against the older's slightly chapped lips, relishing in the slight scrape. Kissing always made him feel a bit hot, and judging by the noises he was making, the same went for Bum. It was very cute, actually seeing a grown man get so flustered from a chaste kiss. He was so vocal. That responsiveness seemed to make their encounters particularly quick, however. No matter how much good they did for the younger man's ego, Bum's cock was already getting slick with pre-cum spread over his ever-pumping hand, and felt like it was twitching a little. He pulled back and gave a sigh he hoped was full of condescension as Bum cried out and his hands were suddenly being coated in warm cum. He had been almost enjoying the timeless feel of skin against skin. Bum panted, coming down from his high, looking for all the world as if he'd seen God. His cheeks were flushed, mouth wet and agape, and his eyes wide and a little wet. He looked like a whore who'd just had the time of her life. It was a good look for him, the taller male thought. "You really have no stamina," Sangwoo complained, before wiping his hand off with Bum's skirt. That action drew a soft sound of protest out of the man that had Sangwoo shooting him a scolding look that cowed the brunette very quickly. "Aren't you grateful?" Sangwoo asked, sounding far more irritated than he actually was. He had to teach his little pet some obedience after all. He even arranged his features into an expression holding a bit more disdain than it had been before. "Oh, I'm sorry, I was just..." Bum trailed off, frantically trying to placate him before succumbing to whatever fate he was envisioning for himself. Sangwoo didn't really get why. He wouldn't hurt him over something so small as a lack of gratitude. And even if he did, it wouldn't be too severe. He was pretty gentle with his captive, all things considered. Sangwoo smiled at him, placating in turn as he unzipped and pulled Bum's skirt off of him. He would have to do laundry anyways, he thought as he tucked it under his arm and left his partner half naked in their bedroom.